December 12, 1942, 14:35 hours. Occupied France, 17 kilometers southeast of Lille. The Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress sits broken in a snow-covered field, its massive shadow stretching across frozen earth like a fallen giant. Steam rises from the fractured No. 3 engine, hissing into the December cold. Major Werner Schultz of the Luftwaffe's Technical Development Command circles the wreckage slowly, his leather boots crunching through ice-crusted snow. He stops at the nose section, running a gloved hand along aluminum skin that's surprisingly intact despite the crash landing that brought her down 6 hours earlier. "Mein Gott!" he whispers, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind him, a team of 15 German engineers and mechanics swarm the downed bomber like surgeons around an operating table. They photograph every panel, every rivet, every structural joint. Oberlieutenant Karl Becker, Schultz's second in command, emerges from under the starboard wing, his face flushed with excitement despite the cold. "Major, you need to see this," Becker says, gesturing toward the bomb bay. Schultz follows him into the belly of the aircraft. Inside, the bomb bay yawns empty, its mechanical release systems still functional despite the violent landing. He traces his fingers along the mounting rails, calculating weight distributions in his head. The numbers trouble him. "How many kilograms?" Schultz asks. "Minimum 2,000, possibly 3,000 with reduced fuel load." Schultz's jaw tightens. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe intelligence has been feeding headquarters estimates based on reconnaissance photographs and intercepted radio chatter. But standing inside this machine, touching its systems, he realizes those estimates were catastrophically wrong. This isn't just a bomber. It's a flying weapons platform that can reach deep into the Reich and return home.
By 16:30 hours, a convoy of 3 Wehrmacht trucks arrives from the nearest Luftwaffe base at Vitry. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, a test pilot with over 3,000 flight hours, steps out of the lead vehicle. He's 42 years old, a veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, and one of the few German pilots qualified to fly captured enemy aircraft. His orders come directly from Luftwaffe High Command. Evaluate this American bomber's capabilities firsthand. Steiner approaches the B-17 with the cautious respect of a man who understands that every aircraft has secrets, strengths and weaknesses hidden in the relationship between weight, power, and aerodynamics. He walks the full circumference of the bomber, noting the position of gun turrets, the size of control surfaces, the complexity of the landing gear. "Can she fly?" he asks Schultz. "The damage is superficial. No. 3 engine is destroyed, but the other 3 are functional. We'll need to replace some hydraulic lines and patch the tail section. But yes, she can fly." Steiner nods slowly. "How long?" 72 hours, perhaps less if we work through the night. "Then begin immediately. I want her airworthy by December 15th. Berlin needs answers, and I intend to deliver them personally." As darkness falls across northern France, portable floodlights illuminate the crash site. German mechanics work in shifts, their tools ringing against aluminum skin. They drain fuel from the damaged engine, reroute electrical systems, and fabricate replacement parts using materials scavenged from Luftwaffe workshops. It's delicate work, repairing an enemy machine without destroying the very characteristics they need to study. Captain Mitchell watches from his guarded position, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee provided by a sympathetic Wehrmacht guard. He knows every system they're repairing. He knows every wire they're connecting. He flew this exact aircraft, tail number 42-5077, nicknamed Lucky Lady, from Bassingbourn, England to Lille on what was supposed to be a routine bombing run against railway yards. But flak found them at 22,000 feet, tearing through their formation and crippling their number 3 engine. With fuel streaming from punctured tanks and hydraulics failing, he'd had no choice but to put her down in the first clear field he could find. Now his bomber would fly again, but under a different flag.
December 15th, 1942, 08:47 hours. Luftwaffe Test Center, Rechlin, Germany. The B-17F sits on the tarmac like an exotic specimen, her American star insignia crudely painted over with German crosses. Hauptmann Steiner completes his pre-flight walk-around as the first pale sunlight breaks through winter clouds. Behind him, a team of observers from Luftwaffe High Command watches from the tower. Generals and technical officers who've traveled from Berlin specifically for this flight. Major Schultz briefs Steiner one final time, his clipboard thick with measurements and calculations compiled during the repair process. All 3 functioning engines show normal compression, Schultz reports. Fuel load is reduced to 60% to compensate for the missing engine. Control surfaces respond within acceptable parameters. However what? Steiner asks. The American crew warned that she tends to pull left on takeoff. Something about propeller torque distribution. I recommend— I'll manage, Steiner interrupts. He's flown captured Soviet fighters, damaged Messerschmitts, and prototype jets that barely held together. He's not intimidated by an American bomber, regardless of its reputation. At 9:15 hours, Steiner climbs through the waist gun position and makes his way forward to the cockpit. The interior is remarkably spacious compared to German bombers, room for 10 men to operate with surprising comfort. He settles into the pilot's seat, and beside him, Oberleutnant Becker takes the co-pilot position. Behind them, 3 Luftwaffe engineers occupy the navigator, bombardier, and radio operator stations. The instruments are labeled in English, but Steiner has studied them extensively. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, rate of climb, manifold pressure, oil temperature. Every gauge tells a story about the machine's performance characteristics. Ready for engine start, Steiner announces. The first engine coughs to life, followed by the second and fourth. Without the third engine, the bomber sounds unbalanced, a 3-note chord where 4 should harmonize. But the right cyclone radials produce impressive power, their propellers biting into cold German air. At 0923 hours, Steiner releases the brakes and pushes the throttles forward. The B-17 rolls down Rechlin's main runway, accelerating slowly under the weight of its own mass. At 80 knots, he pulls back on the yoke, and nothing happens. The bomber stays glued to concrete, speed building but lift refusing to come. 90 knots, 100, the runway is running out. Hauptmann, Becker begins,
his voice tight. Then, at 105 knots, the B-17 breaks free of Earth. The nose lifts, gear leaves pavement, and they're climbing, not gracefully, but climbing nonetheless. Steiner fights the left-pulling tendency Schultz mentioned, applying right rudder to maintain course. Sweat forms on his forehead, despite the cold air streaming through gaps in the cockpit seals. At 5,000 feet, he levels off and begins testing flight characteristics. He banks left, then right, noting how the bomber responds to control inputs. She's heavy, much heavier than the Heinkel He-111s he's accustomed to, but stable, remarkably stable. Even with one engine dead, the B-17 maintains altitude without excessive effort. "Record everything," Steiner commands his engineers. "Control sensitivity, stall characteristics, maximum sustainable speed." For the next 90 minutes, he pushes the bomber through a series of tests: steep turns, controlled descents, maximum power climbs. He simulates combat maneuvers, or attempts to, discovering quickly that this machine isn't designed for agility. It's designed for something else entirely: endurance. At 10:45 hours, flying at 15,000 feet over the Baltic coast, Steiner makes a calculation that chills him more than the December cold. With 4 functioning engines and a full fuel load, this bomber could fly from England to Berlin and back with bombs remaining in its bay. It could reach Munich. It could reach Vienna. It could strike anywhere in occupied Europe and return safely to British bases. "Berlin needs to know," he says quietly to Becker. "They need to know immediately." The landing at Rechlin comes at 11:07 hours, smooth despite the missing engine. As Steiner shuts down the remaining power plants, he sees the generals descending from the observation tower. Their faces tell him they've already reached the same conclusion he has. This American bomber represents a fundamental shift in the air war.
December 18th, 1942, 15:20 hours. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring sits behind his ornate desk, fingers drumming impatiently on mahogany as Hauptmann Steiner delivers his assessment. The office is oppressively warm, heated by radiators working overtime against Berlin's winter cold. On the walls hang paintings of classical German military victories, imagery that seems increasingly disconnected from the reality of modern aerial warfare. Major Schultz stands beside Steiner, holding a leather portfolio thick with technical documentation. Between them, they've compiled a 147-page report on the B-17's capabilities, with performance charts, structural analysis, and strategic projections that paint a troubling picture of what's coming. "You're certain of these range figures?" Göring asks, his tone skeptical. He's heard optimistic reports before, intelligence estimates that proved wildly inaccurate once subjected to combat reality. "Absolutely certain, Herr Reichsmarschall," Steiner replies. "We flew the aircraft ourselves. We measured fuel consumption at various altitudes and power settings. The American bomber, with full fuel and a 2,000-kilogram bomb load, has an operational radius of approximately 900 kilometers from English bases." Göring's expression darkens. He pulls a map of Europe from his desk drawer and spreads it flat. Using a compass, he traces a 900-kilometer arc from airfields in southern England. The circle encompasses Paris, Brussels, Hamburg, and, most troubling of all, the outer suburbs of Berlin itself. "They can reach us here," Göring says quietly. "It's not a question." "Yes, Herr Reichsmarschall," Schultz confirms. "And they can do so in daylight at altitudes above 7,000 meters, where our current flak systems have reduced effectiveness."
Steiner continues the briefing, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he's reporting. The B-17's defensive armament is substantial, 13 machine guns covering all approach vectors. Our fighter tactics, which assume bombers are vulnerable from frontal attack, will need complete revision. The American design specifically addresses that weakness.
Goering rises from his chair and walks to the window overlooking Berlin's government district. Snow falls lightly outside, coating the capital in white that masks the growing strain of war. He's silent for nearly a minute, processing implications that extend far beyond aircraft specifications. "What does Galland recommend?" Goering asks, referring to Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces. Steiner glances at Schultz before responding. "General Galland believes we need heavier armament on our interceptors. The current 7.92 millimeter machine guns are insufficient against the B-17's structural integrity. He's advocating for 20 millimeter and 30 millimeter cannons as standard equipment." "And what of production priorities?" Goering presses. "If the Americans can field hundreds of these bombers—" "Then we must field thousands of fighters," Schultz interrupts, then immediately regrets his breach of protocol. But Goering simply nods. "Continue," the Reich Marshal says. Schultz opens his portfolio and extracts a production analysis. Current intelligence suggests American factories are producing B-17s at a rate exceeding 50 units per month. If this continues, they could have operational fleets of 500 aircraft by mid-1943, possibly 1,000 by 1944. The numbers hang in the air like a death sentence. Germany's fighter production, though impressive, hasn't been designed to counter threats on this scale. The Luftwaffe was built for short-range tactical support of ground forces, lightning warfare across European battlefields. It wasn't designed to defend an entire continent against strategic bombing campaigns executed at altitudes and ranges that German doctrine never anticipated. "What about modifications to our air defense network?" Goering asks, returning to his desk. "Can we adapt existing systems?" Steiner chooses his words carefully. "The flak systems around major cities would need complete reorganization, higher altitude capability, better radar integration, more overlapping fields of fire. It's technically feasible, but it requires resources we're already deploying elsewhere. The Eastern Front devours men and material at a staggering rate. Every gun sent to defend Berlin is a gun not protecting German armies in Russia." The meeting continues for another hour, spiraling through logistics, tactics, and strategic reorientations. Goering orders immediate expansion of fighter production facilities, accelerated development of heavy cannon systems, and a complete overhaul of Luftwaffe training programs to prepare pilots for high-altitude interceptions. At 16:35 hours, as Steiner and Schultz prepare to leave, Goering delivers one final instruction. "Brief the Fuhrer personally. He needs to understand what's coming, and he needs to hear it from pilots who've flown the enemy's machine."
December 22nd, 1942. 13:40 hours. Fuhrer Hauptquartier Wolfschanze, East Prussia. The Wolf's Lair sits buried in dense forest, a sprawling complex of concrete bunkers and wooden barracks designed to withstand aerial bombardment. Hauptmann Steiner and Major Schultz arrive by staff car, passing through multiple security checkpoints before reaching the inner compound where Adolf Hitler maintains his wartime headquarters. The bunker's interior is surprisingly austere. Concrete walls, basic furniture, and maps covering every available surface. Hitler stands over an operations table displaying the Eastern Front, his attention focused on the German advance toward Stalingrad.
He doesn't look up as Steiner and Schultz are announced. The bomber pilots from Rechlin, an aide, announces. Hitler finally raises his head. He's 53 years old, but appears older, his face lined with stress and sleeplessness. His eyes, however, remain sharp, calculating and suspicious in equal measure. "You've analyzed the American aircraft," Hitler states flatly. "It's not a question." "Yes, mein Führer," Steiner replies. "We've flown it, tested it, and assessed its strategic implications." Hitler gestures for them to continue, his attention returning briefly to the Eastern Front map before focusing fully on his visitors. Steiner begins with technical specifications, dimensions, weight, engine power, establishing credibility before delivering harder truths. Hitler listens without interruption, occasionally glancing at Schultz's supporting documentation. When Steiner reaches the range calculations, Hitler's expression shifts. 900 kilometers, you said. Yes, mein Führer. From bases in England, the B-17 can strike targets throughout European-occupied Europe, including major German cities. Hitler walks to a wall map of Europe. His finger traces potential bombing routes. London to Hamburg, London to Berlin, London to Munich. Each line represents German cities vulnerable to attack from aircraft that can fly higher, farther, and with greater payload than anything in the Luftwaffe's current inventory.
The Americans, Hitler says slowly, have always excelled at industrial production, but strategic vision, that has never been their strength. They think in terms of machines and numbers, not will and destiny. Schultz recognizes the beginning of a familiar ideological tangent. He's heard Hitler speak before, witnessed how the Führer interprets tactical realities through his own rigid worldview. But this time, something different occurs. Hitler pauses, returning his attention to the map. "You believe these bombers represent a significant threat," Hitler says, making it a statement rather than a question. "I believe they represent a fundamental change in the air war, mein Führer," Steiner replies carefully. "Our current defenses are optimized for different threats, lower altitude, shorter range, lighter payloads. The B-17 exceeds those parameters in every category." Hitler nods slowly, his hands clasped behind his back as he studies the map. "Reichsmarschall Göring has already briefed me on recommended responses: increased fighter production, heavier armament, enhanced air defense networks." He turns back to face Steiner directly. "Do you believe these measures will be sufficient?" It's a trap. Steiner recognizes it immediately. Agree too readily, and he's underestimating the threat. Disagree, and he's questioning leadership decisions already made. He chooses his words with surgical precision. "The measures are necessary and appropriate, mein Führer. However, their implementation speed is critical. If we can deploy improved defenses before the Americans achieve full operational capability with their bomber fleets, we maintain the advantage. If they reach operational capability first, then German cities burn," Hitler finishes coldly. The statement hangs in the bunker's stale air. Outside, through walls of reinforced concrete, the Eastern Front continues its grinding campaign. Inside, three men confront a different kind of warfare,
one waged not by armies advancing across territory, but by bombers dropping destruction from altitudes where ground forces become irrelevant. Hitler dismisses them at 14:25 hours with orders to continue testing any captured B-17s that fall into German hands. As Schultz and Steiner exit the bunker complex, returning to their waiting car, neither speaks until they're past the final checkpoint. "He understood," Schultz says finally. "Yes," Steiner agrees. "Whether he acts on that understanding, that's a different question." They drive back toward Berlin through snow-covered forests, carrying knowledge that will reshape German air defense strategy for the remainder of the war.
March 15th, 1943, 11:47 hours, Schweinfurt, Germany. 5 months after Hauptmann Steiner's test flight, the warnings delivered to Hitler began manifesting as reality. Formation after formation of B-17s crossed the German border, their contrails writing prophecy across blue sky. The targets today are ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, critical industrial facilities that supply German tank and aircraft production. Obergefreiter Hans Weber mans an 88mm flak gun on the outskirts of the city. He's 19 years old, trained for 3 months before being assigned to air defense duty. Through binoculars, he watches the approaching bombers, dozens of them, flying in tight formations that present overlapping fields of defensive fire. "Range 6,000 meters, his gun commander calls out. "Elevation 45 degrees, prepare to fire." The 88M barks, sending shells screaming upward toward the American formation. All around the city, hundreds of flak guns open fire simultaneously, filling the sky with black bursts of exploding steel. But the bombers are high, nearly 8,000 meters, at the upper limit of the flak system's effective range. Weber watches his shells explode below the formation, deadly but impotent. A few bombers take damage, one trailing smoke from a wounded engine, but the formation continues inexorably toward its target. He loads another shell, fires, and watches it too detonate harmlessly below the attackers. "Higher!" he shouts in frustration. "We need higher elevation." But the guns are already at maximum capability. The modifications recommended after Steiner's report, improved elevation mechanisms, better range-finding equipment, haven't arrived yet. Production delays, resource prioritization, the eternal calculus of wartime logistics. So Weber fires shells that explode too low, while bombers above drop payloads that explode with devastating precision.
8,000 meters above Weber's position, Lieutenant James Morrison guides his B-17, tail number 425723, nicknamed Thunder Road, toward the initial point of the bomb run. He's 24 years old, from Iowa, flying his 7th mission over Germany. In his headset, he hears the bombardier counting down to release. Bomb bay open. Steady. Steady. Bombs away. The B-17 lurches upward as 2 tons of high explosive ordnance falls free. Around Morrison, 17 other bombers in his formation release simultaneously, creating a carpet of destruction that walks across the ball-bearing factories below. Secondary explosions blossom, orange and black against industrial gray, as bombs find their targets. But the mission isn't without cost. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed the formation,
pressing attacks from frontal quarters where the B-17's defensive fire is concentrated. Morrison watches one bomber in his formation, Lucky Strike, take cannon fire through the nose, killing the bombardier instantly. The aircraft falls away, trailing flame. Fighters, 12 o'clock high, his top turret gunner screams. Morrison has read intelligence briefings about German fighter tactics, how they've adapted to the B-17's defensive capabilities, concentrating fire on engines and cockpits rather than making passes across the fuselage. The tactics work. He sees 3 more bombers fall before the formation clears the target area and turns for home. Back on the ground, Webers surveys the damage. The ball-bearing factories burn, sending black smoke thousands of meters into the air. Around him, his gun crew sits in exhausted silence, having fired over 200 shells with minimal effect. The bombers came, dropped their payloads, and departed, exactly as Steiner's report predicted they could. In Berlin, Luftwaffe High Command receives after-action reports that confirm their worst projections. The Americans lost 14 B-17s during the Schweinfurt raid. Significant losses, but not enough to deter future operations. German fighter units claimed 23 kills, but post-mission analysis suggests actual losses were lower. The mathematics are brutal. For every bomber destroyed, 2 more roll off American production lines. Major Schultz, now assigned to Air Defense Coordination, studies the raid data with growing concern. Everything Steiner discovered during his test flight has been validated by combat. The B-17 can reach deep into Germany, survive fighter attacks through defensive firepower, and deliver devastating bomb loads with precision. And the Americans are just beginning. Current intelligence suggests hundreds more bombers are training in the United States, preparing for deployment to England.
August 17, 1943. 14:22 hours, Regensburg, Germany. 9 months after Steiner's warning, the daylight bombing campaign reaches its crescendo. Today's mission is particularly audacious. 146 B-17s targeting Messerschmitt production facilities in Regensburg, followed by a second wave striking ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt again. The Americans call it a double strike, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm German defenses through sheer scale. Hauptmann Steiner watches the raid from a Luftwaffe command post near Munich. He's no longer flying test missions. His knowledge of American bomber capabilities has made him too valuable for frontline risk. Instead, he coordinates fighter responses, using insights gained from his B-17 test flight to predict bomber formations and attack vectors. Through radio communications, he listens to German fighter pilots engaging the American formations. The transmissions paint a picture of desperate combat, Messerschmitts making head-on passes at closing speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour, trying to break bomber formations before they reach their targets. Some succeed, most don't. Red Leader, this is Red 3. I've made 4 passes on a formation over Augsburg. Minimal damage observed. These machines absorb punishment like... The transmission cuts off abruptly. Steiner knows what happened. Red 3 flew too close, caught in the converging fire of multiple B-17 gun positions. That's how the Americans fight, not through individual aircraft superiority, but through mutual support
and overwhelming firepower. The combat box formation allows 12 to 18 bombers to create a defensive sphere where approaching fighters face fire from dozens of machine guns simultaneously. He'd reported this capability in his December briefing. He'd warned that German fighter tactics would need fundamental revision. Now, 8 months later, those warnings manifest as casualties.
At 14:45 hours, the bombers clear German airspace, heading west toward Switzerland and eventual return to England. Steiner receives preliminary damage reports, 36 B-17s lost, possibly more unconfirmed. German fighter losses exceed 50 aircraft, with 27 pilots dead or missing. The mathematics are unsustainable. The Americans lose bombers, but replace them within weeks. The Luftwaffe loses pilots, irreplaceable men with years of training and combat experience faster than training programs can produce replacements. It's a war of attrition that Germany cannot win through current tactics. That evening, Steiner sits in his quarters reviewing combat film from the day's raids. The footage shows B-17s absorbing cannon fire that would destroy any German bomber, yet continuing to fly. One aircraft, struck repeatedly in the fuselage, maintains formation for 20 kilometers before finally falling away. Another, with 2 engines destroyed, limps toward Switzerland on remaining power. There's a knock at his door. Major Schultz enters, carrying a classified dispatch from Luftwaffe High Command. "New orders," Schultz says quietly. "They want you to brief fighter group commanders personally, share everything you learned from the test flight. Tactics, vulnerabilities, weak points in the B-17's defensive coverage." Steiner takes the dispatch and reads it carefully. The orders are clear. His knowledge, gained during 90 minutes flying a captured bomber, must now be disseminated throughout the entire fighter force. It's an acknowledgement that the warnings he delivered 9 months ago were not just accurate, but prophetic. "When do I start?" Steiner asks. "Tomorrow. First briefing is at Rechlin, 0800 hours. Then Brandenburg, then Jever. 12 airfields, total over 3 weeks." Steiner nods slowly. Outside his window, the August sun sets over Munich, painting the sky in colors that remind him of burning cities. Somewhere over the English Channel, American bomber crews return to their bases, exhausted but alive. They'll rest, rearm, and return, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps next week. And when they do, German fighters will be waiting with tactics refined by hard lessons learned at devastating cost. The war of bombers and fighters will continue for 2 more years. Thousands more aircraft will fall from European skies. Tens of thousands of aircrew will die in burning metal or frozen clouds. But the strategic reality revealed during Hauptmann Steiner's test flight will never change. The B-17 Flying Fortress brought warfare to altitudes and ranges that transformed aerial combat into strategic devastation. In December 1942, one German pilot flew an enemy machine and understood immediately what it meant. By August 1943, the entire Luftwaffe understood. By war's end, the lesson would be written in fire across the skies of Germany. Written by aluminum wings carrying destruction from horizons that defensive systems could barely reach. The captured B-17 that Steiner flew was eventually destroyed during an Allied bombing raid on Rechlin in October 1943. But its legacy persisted in every tactical modification, every strategic adjustment, and every German pilot who learned to respect the capabilities of American engineering. The test flight lasted 90 minutes. The changes it precipitated lasted until Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945.